Good evening. Good evening. It's great to see so many people out for one of our own who's speaking tonight. It's amazing that it's already August, but due to the quirks of the calendar, there's still 5 more forums left, including tonight. So, no despair. We still have many more forums before the season ends. Now, as I mentioned before, the forum committee never sleeps. We're always looking for people who can speak, and then once we have them, we spend a lot of time making sure they actually do speak. And so we're looking for help. What we're basically saying is if you know some interesting people, and they really have expertise on matters of regional or national importance, and they know how to speak, let us know. Go to islesboroforum.org or just grab one of the committee members. You can see them up here on the slide. So just come on up and ask any one of us and say, I've got a great suggestion. So in any event, it's time to get on to the show. To introduce our next speaker is our friend, our neighbor, Peter Rothschild. Peter?
Thank you, Bruce. We need to get a hook here for Bruce, But anyway, no, he's doing a wonderful job, inspiring us all. I didn't realize until I looked into this and talked to Peter about his speech tonight, The Atlantic, which I love. Jeff Goldberg is one of my great heroes. Founded in 1858 by none other than Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. So I don't know, Peter perhaps will tell you the genesis of the Emerson Collective, of which he's a managing director of media. The company started and run by Lorene Powell Jobs, widow of Steve Jobs, but it's so inspiring. I wasn't looking behind me. All I can say is Peter has already inspired me just by sending me a brief resume, which is extraordinary. Includes the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal before he was recruited by Lorene. But I have to say there's a special place in my heart for investigative journalism and the state of American journalism. What more timely, appropriate topic, and I can see by the size of this audience you agree, could we have a speaker here at the forum? Thank you all. Peter, also known as Mr. Illida's Isabel Gillies.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you to the Islesboro Forum for having me this evening. And it's so great to see so many friends in the audience. I'm going to take the liberty of dedicating this talk to my father-in-law, Arch Gillies. So I know a lot of you knew and loved Arch, and if you knew Arch, you knew that he was a real news junkie and a real lover of journalism. He was the closest reader of the New York Times that I knew personally. He'd sit in his armchair reading the paper cover to cover, seemingly didn't miss a single article. And a quick story about him. So when Isabel, Arch's daughter, who's here, and I became serious, I was a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. Now, also, if you knew Arch, you knew that Arch was decidedly not a fan of the Wall Street Journal. He did not exactly agree with the journal's editorial page, to say the least. And he really had little interest in the daily swings of the bond market or the latest story on a big private equity deal. But the minute that Isabel and I got engaged, Arch subscribed to the Wall Street Journal. And then for 4 years, on every single one of my stories, he would send me an email with some thoughtful observation or a sentence that he liked. And, I love so much about him, but I really love that. And in 2010, I got a job at his beloved New York Times. And on that very day, he canceled his subscription to the Wall Street Journal. So, as Peter scooped, I want to start with a autographed photo of Richard Nixon, and you're probably wondering why. So this picture is hanging outside the corporate boardroom at the New York Times. And there's this portrait gallery that features every president since Teddy Roosevelt and world leaders like Sadat and de Gaulle, and it's a cool, really cool hallway. So Joe Biden, for instance, President Biden inscribed his photo, "A free press is the rock upon which democracy is built." And this is Nixon's, which he signed in 1980. To the New York Times, some read it and like it, some read it and don't like it, but everybody reads it. With best wishes from Richard Nixon. Now, Nixon was hardly an admirer of the press. The Washington Post famously broke the Watergate scandal, and it was his administration that tried to prevent the publication of the Pentagon Papers. But even Nixon here is acknowledging journalism's reach, its authority, and its important place in American life. And I'm highlighting this inscription really because of what it says about how much our journalism landscape has shifted over the past 50 years. There was once a broad recognition that an independent press occupied an essential place in American democracy. The founders believed in it so strongly that freedom of the press is one of the fundamental freedoms inscribed or explicitly protected by the First Amendment. And today, that reverence does not exist, certainly not with the current president and not with much of the country. Instead, there is dislike and disrespect for the media. Now look, of course, the press has always been polarizing, and accusations of liberal bias are nothing new in the mainstream media and even at the New York Times. But today, something has really changed. And this is in part because of persistent rants of fake news and enemies of the people coming from the White House, not to mention vexatious lawsuits. But many Americans no longer trust journalism. And at the same time, over the past 25 years, a very powerful parallel right-wing media, led by Fox News and conservative talk show radio hosts, has grown into a very powerful force. And the result now is a country without a common set of facts. The information landscape is splintered, and Americans are operating in not just two separate realities, but infinitely more. So I'm going to divide my remarks into three parts. First, I'm going to start with the challenges facing journalism. Second, let's get Richard Nixon off there. Liz Stevens is happy about that. Second, I'll highlight an example of national journalism from our own portfolio that gives me some hope, and that's The Atlantic. And then third, I'll briefly discuss the efforts to rebuild local news across the United States, where I believe some of the most important and encouraging work in American journalism is happening. So, the latest surveys show that public trust in the media has fallen to the lowest levels ever recorded, and an increasing share of Americans now say they have zero trust in the press. There are many reasons for this collapse, but three forces stand out. I'll call them politics, power, and platforms. So first, politics. No modern president has attacked the press as aggressively or relentlessly as Donald Trump. We've seen regulatory pressure on broadcasters from a politicized FCC, a wave of lawsuits against major news organizations, and a growing willingness to target journalists directly. The search of a Washington Post reporter's home in a leak investigation and the arrests of journalists covering anti-ICE demonstrations are just two examples of how reporters are increasingly caught in the crosshairs. Second, there's power. So ownership of media is becoming more and more concentrated, and many of those owners are currying favor and kowtowing to the White House. Skydance Media, owned by the Trump-friendly Ellison family, has acquired CBS News, and if it acquires CNN, will control two major news brands. At the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos has overseen a period of turmoil, firing nearly half the staff and leaving a once great newspaper in disarray. Meanwhile, hundreds of local newspapers have collapsed across the country, and many of the ones that remain are owned by hedge funds that are cutting their newsrooms to the bone. The third and most existential challenge is platforms. So more than half of Americans now get their news not from news, but primarily from Facebook groups and TikTok. And these platforms reward outrage and partisanship over fact-based reporting. And the rise, of course, of artificial intelligence and LLMs like ChatGPT and Claude have further complicated things, to put it mildly. So the pressures and threats to journalism are very substantial, but they are not the whole story. So with that, let's turn to The Atlantic, which offers, I would like to submit to you some grounds for hope. And before I tell you about The Atlantic today, a little bit about its history. So as Peter alluded to, the magazine was conceived of in 1857 by a group of abolitionists having dinner at Boston's Parker House Hotel. Fun fact, the Parker House Hotel is where Parker House rolls come from. So this group included Ralph Waldo Emerson, where Emerson Collective, in a happy coincidence, gets its name, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, James Russell Lowell, and Oliver Wendell Holmes, along with a handful of other men with 3 names and impeccable Brahmin breeding. And I know what some of you are probably thinking, they did not set out to exclude women. Harriet Beecher Stowe, also 3 words, she was invited but boycotted the dinner when she learned that alcohol would be served. So from the beginning, The Atlantic was meant to be more than a literary magazine. Its founders were writers and intellectuals, but they were also reformers. And the magazine quickly became an important voice against slavery. And since its founding, The Atlantic has really published an extraordinary range of writers. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who served as the magazine's Civil War correspondent, Frederick Douglass and Walt Whitman, W.E.B. Du Bois, Emily Dickinson and Virginia Woolf, Mark Twain and Philip Roth, T.S. Eliot, George Eliot, the list goes on and on. The Atlantic was politically engaged from the start, but never intended to be partisan. Its founding declaration promised, as it reads up there, that in politics, the Atlantic Monthly will be the organ of no party or clique, but will honestly endeavor to be the exponent of the American idea. So that idea still guides The Atlantic today. The magazine has always tried to remain intellectually independent, to publish conservative, liberal, and heterodox voices, and to judge ideas on their merits rather than their party affiliation. But The Atlantic does not pretend to be neutral about the basic principles of constitutional democracy. So in 169 years, The Atlantic has only endorsed 5 presidential candidates. Abraham Lincoln in 1960, because, well, he was Abraham Lincoln. Lyndon Johnson in 1964, who ran against Barry Goldwater. And Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and Kamala Harris. The last 3 endorsements have something in common, and they also have nothing to do with an allegiance to the Democratic Party. They were all made in elections involving Donald Trump. Jeff Goldberg, the Atlantic's editor-in-chief, has consistently maintained that democracy needs strong conservative and liberal ideas to thrive. So the magazine's objection to Trump is not that he is a Republican. Here's what the editors of The Atlantic wrote a decade ago when they endorsed Clinton in 2016. They described her as someone, quote, who has flaws, but is also among the most prepared candidates ever to seek the presidency, end quote. Donald Trump, on the other hand, they wrote, has no record of public service and no qualifications for public office. His affect is that of an infomercial huckster. He traffics in conspiracy theories and racist invective. He is appallingly sexist. He expresses admiration for authoritarian rulers and evinces authoritarian tendencies himself. He is an enemy of fact-based discourse and is ignorant of and indifferent to the Constitution. He appears not to read, end quote. It's amazing. He had not been elected president yet. This was, of course, an editorial endorsing Clinton in the fall of 2016. So, look, when accused of bias, which The Atlantic, of course, is directly by the president, or being called a political opposition party, Jeff Goldberg likes to borrow a line from the former Washington Post editor, Marty Barron, who tussled quite a bit with Trump during his first term. We're not at war, we're at work. So, look, doing that work requires a strong and sustainable business. So I'm going to just very briefly turn to The Atlantic's business model that makes its journalism possible. In 2017, Emerson Collective, where I work, acquired The Atlantic from a Washington businessman named David Bradley, who had owned it for 20 years. And he actually bought it from a real estate billionaire named Mort Zuckerman, who owned it 20 years before that. So I'll spare you most of the financial details for this talk, but the results over the past 9 years have been very encouraging. The Atlantic now has 1.6 million paid subscribers and has been profitable for nearly 4 years. And I would say there are two main reasons for this. One is that in September 2019, The Atlantic put up a paywall for its digital journalism. And as you can see from this chart, subscriptions since then have grown steadily, which has allowed us to expand the newsroom and invest more heavily in our journalism. And we also, parenthetically, believe in print. So in the 2000s, The Atlantic reduced its print frequency from 12 issues a year to 10 issues a year. And we actually had to drop the name The Atlantic Monthly, and then it became The Atlantic. But in 2025, so just last year, we returned to a monthly schedule. So we're now back to 12 months a year, but we're going to keep the name The Atlantic. We're not going to go back to The Atlantic Monthly. So the other major reason for The Atlantic's success may be the most important one, which is talent. Journalism, like sports and so many other pursuits, is a talent business. And there are certain people out there who can, think, report, and write better than other people. And over the past decade, Jeff Goldberg and his editors have assembled a really remarkable newsroom of talent. And here's just a sampling. So these are just a few of the all-stars on the squad. You have Ann Applebaum, who writes a lot about democracy and authoritarianism. George Packer on the bottom here, who writes about American life and foreign affairs. Mark Leibovich and Tim Alberta on politics. Caitlin Dickerson, who won a Pulitzer Prize for her reporting on immigration. And David Brooks, of course, who we just hired full-time from the New York Times, who writes about all sorts of stuff, but American culture and civic life. And then Ashley Parker, who came over from the Washington Post. And I highlight her, A, because she's fabulous, but also because we've hired 31 reporters and editors from the Washington Post over the past year. I think everyone wants to see a very strong Washington Post, but in this particular case, their losses have been our gains. And look, what this really shows is, a lesson that we've learned repeatedly at the Atlantic, which is that readers are willing to pay for high-quality journalism that's engaging, authoritative, and well-written. And that's kind of the simplicity of the business model. Now, I can't talk about the Atlantic without mentioning Signalgate, which I suspect a lot of you remember. So last year, the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, accidentally included Jeff Goldberg on a Signal thread discussing a military operation in Yemen with J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, and Pete Hegseth. Jeff's first thought was that the messages were an elaborate hoax, that he was being set up. But when the bombs dropped on the Houthis at the exact time that the text said they would, Jeff, while sitting in his car in a Safeway parking lot, realized that this was all likely very real. So once he verified its authenticity and determined that the publication would not be putting any American lives in danger, the Atlantic broke the astonishing story that top officials had been brazenly discussing sensitive war plans on a commercial messaging app with a journalist. So from inside the Atlantic, it was a crazy and at first deadly serious couple of weeks. I learned about the story a week before its publication through our lawyers, both our general counsel and our outside lawyers, who wanted to make sure that Jeff was walled off from everyone. They weren't putting anything past the Trump administration, and there was a genuine fear that the FBI was going to raid the Atlantic's offices and arrest Jeff for violating the Espionage Act. So when the story came out, we were bracing for a serious confrontation with federal law enforcement. But instead, to our surprise, the first wave of public reaction was laughter. And what happened was the sheer absurdity of the entire situation, that the nation's most powerful officials had accidentally included the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic in their group chat, became fodder for late-night comics and SNL. The story had a huge impact, so it reached nearly 9 million readers in its first week and led to more than 100,000 new subscriptions. Mike Waltz soon lost his job as National Security Advisor, though now he's ambassador to the United Nations. The DOJ ended up not going after Jeff Goldberg at all, though earlier this year, the FBI director, Kash Patel, did sue The Atlantic for a different story about Patel's erratic behavior and excessive drinking. So now I'd like to just move quickly to local news, where the picture is especially grim. Nearly 3,500 newspapers have shut down across the country, leading swaths of Americans without accurate, factual coverage of their communities. The business model of local news is completely imperiled, and so many once great newspapers, like the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, or say the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, where Gail Jackson lives, these papers are shadows of their former selves. And this is a problem because at the most basic level, people need to know what their public officials are doing and what is happening in their schools, their courts, and state houses. Researchers have linked the decline of local news to lower voter participation, increased corruption, and greater polarization. Instead of reading their local news, people sit at home and watch either Fox News or MSNBC, and they're not engaged in what's going on in their towns or cities. But don't take my word for it. Just ask Alexis de Tocqueville. So writing in Democracy in America in 1840, almost 200 years ago, Tocqueville called a newspaper an advisor that you do not need to go find, but which appears by itself and speaks to you daily and briefly about common affairs, without disturbing you in your private affairs. And then he made the larger point. Newspapers do more than just guarantee liberty. They maintain civilization. Maintain civilization is a pretty lofty claim, but Tocqueville's underlying point was that newspapers let people know what is happening beyond their homes and help them act together. When local news disappears, a community loses both information and a shared place to talk about its problems. But here there's hope as well. Across the United States, nonprofit local newsrooms are beginning to fill the void left by the decline of the for-profit newspaper business. The Texas Tribune, for example, does a fantastic job covering politics in that enormously and politically complicated state. Vermont Digger, VT Digger, is now the largest newsroom in Vermont. And in Mississippi, a newsroom called Mississippi Today won a Pulitzer Prize for exposing a massive welfare scandal in the state. And here in Maine, there's actually a great deal happening in nonprofit local news. I'd encourage you all to check out Maine Monitor, an excellent newsroom producing investigative and deeply reported stories across Maine. The nonprofit National Trust for Local News now owns the Portland Press Herald and several other Maine newspapers. And then there's smaller nonprofit outlets like the Harpswell Anchor and the Rising Tide, which is on the Blue Hill Peninsula, that are serving their own communities and doing a great job. So the case for nonprofit local news, which I'd all encourage you to support, is fairly simple. Ticket sales alone cannot sustain museums, operas, ballets. We all recognize that libraries and hospitals and other vital local institutions need philanthropic support. And increasingly, what's becoming clear around the United States is that communities are realizing that nonpartisan, fact-based local news is a civic good that belongs on that list of all those institutions that deserve our support. So that's why Emerson has made nonprofit local news a major part of its media work. And we provide direct support to several dozen local newsrooms around the country. And then in 2019, we actually helped stand up an organization called the American Journalism Project, which raises and distributes philanthropic funding to nonprofit newsrooms. And since then, American Journalism Project has raised more than $250 million for local news. So these dots on the map represent newsrooms that are supported by Emerson Collective and AJP. So I've talked this evening about a profession under real pressure from politicians, from a broken business model, and now from technologies producing misinformation and AI slop. But the Atlantic and these local newsrooms offer some evidence that the story is not just one of decline. And come to think of it, all the journalism business really needs is more people like Arch Gillies. If we only had more readers who cared, readers who paid attention to what's going on in the world and in their cities and towns, we'd all be in much better shape. So with that, let's move to questions. I'd love to hear what's on your mind. How do we do this? Just call on.
Okay. One of your red dots, Mr. Chairman, indicates the Emerson Collective was in the state of Maine. What are you doing in this great state of ours?
Yeah. So we support a few different things. The main news organization that we support is called the Maine Monitor. It's a nonprofit newsroom, does great investigative work. It's run by a woman who lives in Belfast named Mika Schweitzer-Blum. The editor-in-chief is a woman named Kate Koff. They've come here a couple of times and given great presentations. So I think they're one of the best up-and-coming newsrooms in the state. And then for some reason, I think Maine happens to be a very engaged state. There's a lot of work being done across the state in nonprofit news. I just had a call a few days ago with a guy named John Boyd, who I feel like knows some people probably in this room. He's a close friend of Abbott Lawrence's. And he started a small newsroom on the Blue Hill Peninsula called The Rising Tide. And he's done it, on his own, and he's writing a lot of the stories, and he's growing, and he's getting support. So it's happening all across the state. But the Maine Monitor is my personal favorite, the one I check out.
Regarding platform, I saw a story a few years ago comparing the amount of time a reader will spend when reading something in hard print versus online. And it was something like 30 minutes versus 3 minutes. So given these trends of moving away from print, where do you see people's ability to pull in the depth of this information if we start losing print as our main source of information?
Yeah, it's exactly the right question. Can you just hand me that magazine? If you just bring it up. So the August issue of The Atlantic, the title of the cover story is "The Age of Reading is Over." Talk about uplifting. And it's a fascinating and very provocative story how we're entering a post-literate age, and everyone is just watching short-form vertical videos, and they're scrolling on their phones, and they're not reading. And the data in the story is really alarming. And it was written by this actually young rising star who's a 25-year-old, hotshot out of Yale, and she's fantastic. And so she writes it from the perspective of her own generation and how they're not reading. She wrote a very well-read story last year, or she wrote a very well-read story last year in the Atlantic about how college students aren't reading entire books anymore, and professors can't assign entire books because the students just don't have the attention spans. So this is like talking about a profound existential problem. So what are news organizations doing about it? I mean, if you just go to the New York Times app, you can see that the New York Times has become a very video-forward app, and they put their reporters, on these videos. They have like live news feeds like, CNN does now, because they realize that they have to, in some ways, meet their subscribers where they are. But I do worry that it's a bit of a race to the bottom. And, the Atlantic isn't giving up on the words business. So we're going to try and keep it going.
What's the story of the Emerson Collective? Where did you come from? What is it that you do? How are you organized?
Yeah. Thanks for that. So I joined Emerson almost exactly 10 years ago in April 2016. It's a company. It's an LLC. It's not a foundation, which is somewhat unique in how a lot of Silicon Valley philanthropists have set up their organizations, not as foundations, but as companies. It was started by Laurene Powell Jobs, Steve Jobs' widow. And when I joined 10 years ago, depending on how you count, I was employee number 12 or 13. She was just starting to build her organization into something substantial, and she started talking to me about wanting to use media and journalism as a piece of what she wanted to achieve. Back in 2016, Steve Jobs had been dead for 5 years. He's not, he died 15 years ago in October. So since then, she's built Emerson into a company with 250 people, and we do work across a range of different issues, both for-profit investing and nonprofit philanthropy. We do it out of the same entity. So, for someone like me who oversees the media and journalism work, we make investments in media companies of varying size stakes, like The Atlantic, and then we also give away money philanthropically to nonprofit media. And then I have counterparts who work across all different issues, so education, immigration, climate, gun violence reduction. She's a major supporter of, Democratic candidates and causes. And that's kind of gives you a sense of what Emerson looks like.
One of the things with media you're talking about, where does poverty play in this? you've got two different kinds of people who read or don't read, or who are educated and not educated, and having a group like here, who are the lucky ones, is very different than, you know, a street corner in Mississippi in a bayou or a bayou. How do you reach them and get them engaged, because they are often the most affected by policies which are anti-them?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is a almost companion question to the one about people not reading anymore. You know, this is a big issue for the journalism business. For one thing, you know, as I explained, we put up a digital paywall, right? So to read The Atlantic online, you know, you might get a certain number of articles for free. It's a dynamic paywall, but you'll bump up against it and have to pay, you know, $90 a year for a subscription, and most people can't afford that. There's a survey, I think, that says that only 12% of Americans pay for news in some way, whether they subscribe to something or support, you know, their local news organization. So what does that mean for people who can't afford, you know, to read the news? You know, you have to, you know, work hard to reach those readers. And, you know, one of the things that we're struggling with at Emerson, and I should have mentioned this when I was describing the organization, is, you know, literacy and child literacy has become like one of our core issues. You know, when we've gone into cities and supported newsrooms in places like Cleveland or Baltimore, the illiteracy rates are, you know, frankly, jaw-dropping. And this is a real problem if you're trying to reach people with journalism and news. So, you know, one of the things that gives me some, you know, energy working in a place like Emerson is I know we're working on issues, you know, across the board. We're not just supporting journalism, we're supporting, you know, issues that are hoping, you know, raise up people out of poverty and improve literacy rates and things like that. But it's a huge problem.
I want to give a shout out to our local paper, the Islesboro Island News. Is there a way to get a small town paper nominated for a Pulitzer Prize? They're doing a fantastic job, and how would that happen?
You know, I sent, is Dan Tudor here? Or no? I sent him a note because I was reading his stories back in New York, and I thought they were awesome about, you know, the affordability crisis on the island, and it's been a great series, and he has a great voice, and, you know, I'm going to be kicking myself later for not, when I answered about what Maine is doing in the journalism business, that I didn't mention the Islesboro Island News. I totally should have. But I'm a reader. I get it at home on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and it is a great paper, and you ran a lovely obituary on my father-in-law, so thank you.
Peter, you work with young people in your organization, but just generally, what about people in their 20s? Are they reading? I mean, just the profile of the effect of that as it applies to what you've been talking about.
Young people, yeah, and whether they're engaged with the news. You know, we're hitting on some themes here which we really struggle with. You know, the average age of an Atlantic reader is actually younger than you would think. It's in the mid to late 50s. No, for real. I mean, the average age of like PBS NewsHour watchers and, you know, the broadcast news is like 72. Jeff Goldberg, who hosts Washington Week with the Atlantic on Friday nights on PBS, he has this line. He says that when he's in an airport and he sees an 80-year-old woman walking toward him, he knows that they're going to say, "My mother loves Washington Week with the Atlantic." Point being that young people are not consuming news in the way that they should be, and this is one of the, you know, big endeavors of the Atlantic and a lot of young, you know, other news organizations to bring younger readers on board. I mean, at the New York Times, for instance, I'll tell you, you know, the reason why it's pushing into all these other businesses like games and cooking and it bought The Athletic to build out its sports coverage, the Wirecutter, News You Can Use. It's to diversify because they know that the news business, even though it's their core business, is not what's, bringing in serious subscription growth. It's all this other stuff. A.G. Sulzberger, the publisher of the New York Times, likes to joke that, he's now a games company with like a journalism, business attached to it. And I'm afraid that there's some truth to that.
And how does this affect our democracy?
Yeah, if
No tough question.
yeah, no, I mean that's the whole game, right? I mean, if younger voters are not engaged with the news, I could tell you for the midterms and for the 2028 elections, my colleagues who work on politics and policy, they're pulling their hair out trying to figure out ways that they can reach voters 18 to 34, because voters 18 to 34 are sadly mostly not reading newspapers or magazines or watching the broadcast news. They're on TikTok and Instagram Reels, and that's all they're on. So it's like, do you invest in influencers and content creators online who are mission aligned with, how you're trying to sway the electorate? These are not easy answers, but people are trying to reach younger voters where they are, and unfortunately, that's on the social media platforms. Charlie.
Peter, are there for-profit local newsrooms that are making it work? And if so, is there a common string through those, a way that they're changing the business model that's making the for-profit model work at the local level?
Yeah, so Charlie Brontes gives me hope. He's a young man who does read the news and is engaged in politics. So thank you, Charlie. I would argue that the for-profit local news business model is largely broken. It's not coming back. I'll give you a couple of examples. The Salt Lake Tribune in Utah used to be a for-profit newspaper, and it was bought about 15 years ago by the Huntsman family. John Huntsman and Paul Huntsman, big chemical business in Utah. And they're very community-oriented, very involved in politics. They bought the biggest newspaper in Utah, and they tried to make it work as a for-profit endeavor, and they couldn't. It was losing money every year, hand over fist. So they appealed to the IRS to convert it to a nonprofit, and the IRS granted them the right to do that. So the Huntsman family converted it to a 501c3, and now the Salt Lake Tribune, still the largest newsroom in Utah. They do a great job of covering the state. They're a nonprofit. The same thing has happened in Philadelphia at the Inquirer. A guy named Jerry Lenfest bought the paper, and it's a complicated structure, but it's effectively a nonprofit. And the Minnesota Star Tribune, which has been a very successful paper because Minnesota has a lot of characteristics, a very engaged state, sort of insular and involved with itself. They were successful for a long time, but they just said that they too are seriously considering moving to a nonprofit structure. So I'm afraid it's just like a slow drip, but over time I think all these for-profit newspapers, the local newspapers, are going to collapse.
You talked about how people are not absorbing written content, particularly young people, particularly that's in a long form. But what about the risk they won't know how to write content in a long form? They'll just use AI. Who needs to know how to write? Tell them your idea and let it write.
Yeah, so I mentioned AI just briefly in my talk because it's obviously such a profound thing that's going on in all of our lives. That's almost more an education question, and my education-focused colleagues, I actually don't know how they don't wake up every morning and just bang their heads against the wall, because that is really, really tough, especially in the age of AI. Our kids are in their 20s and have been educated, thank goodness, but if I had children who are 8 and 10 years old, I'd be terrified that they're not going to learn how to write, they're not going to learn how to think creatively or analytically. but that's a whole other conversation. And look, AI does not bode well for journalism. It just adds another problem and challenge to the mix.
Do you have a policy in terms of your journalists, when they can and how they use AI?
Yeah, I mean, Jeff Goldberg is very, very strict on this, and says that the Atlantic's journalism is, of humans, by humans, and for humans, and he doesn't want anyone using AI. But look, I'm sure most of you use it, and I'm a little bit skeptical. Like, I wonder if a reporter's on deadline, how is anyone going to know if they're using AI? It's a scary prospect, and you just have to operate on the honor code and have strong ethics, but it's a slippery slope.
So how does the Atlantic or any other news product try to be unbiased, try to paint both sides of the picture? What do you hire, when you hire new journalists, is that a litmus test for, are you Republican, are you Democrat, are you conservative, are you liberal? I mean, how do you?
I mean, look, the Atlantic works very hard at this. I mean, let's face it. I mentioned during my talk that there's, always been accusations of liberal bias in the media. And, I was a reporter and editor at the Wall Street Journal and New York Times for a dozen or so years. And, I will tell you that most of the reporters and editors in the newsroom are liberal. Jeff Goldberg likes to joke that, all of his staff lives in the, socialist belt stretching from Williamsburg to Astoria, or something like that. And it's just that's just the truth of it. But Jeff really works incredibly hard to create, a diverse newsroom of, heterodoxical thinkers who are not necessarily, on one pole or the other. And look, it's been hard in the Trump era. David Frum, who's on the staff, I could have had his picture on one of the slides. He was a speechwriter for George W. Bush, and he is a, arch conservative. But since since he came down the staircase, David Frum has been, at the tip of the spear of, anti-Trumpism and has written books about it. So in the Trump era, it's been hard, but, we're always hiring, right-leaning or sort of interesting thinkers who aren't sort of, hopelessly biased toward the left. I'll just give you one. Michael Powell, some of you might know his byline from the New York Times. We brought him on, and just today we posted a story by him about these cities like Seattle that are, have very liberal drug legalization laws, and he did reporting in Seattle and wrote about what a disaster it is. And that, isn't something that you'd necessarily see from a, hopelessly lefty publication. Andrew.
Peter, thank you. If there's a late-breaking story, nationally, globally, something that you need to be informed about, where does Peter Lattman go to be fully informed first?
Yeah. I'm a little bit of a Twitter or X addict, and I've set up my feed so it's, geared toward the news organizations that are usually breaking news. So that's probably how I get the information fastest. In the role I'm in right now, I don't need to be on top of the news as much as I was when I was, at the Times or the Wall Street Journal. But I'd say, Twitter does a really good job of staying at, the top of the news, and most of the stuff that breaks you can find there. And then I'm pretty much a traditionalist when it comes to news consumption. I read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Bloomberg. So, yeah. And one thing I'll say about these, I wanted to say this. I worry, and this goes to some of the questions about the future of news. Like one thing I worry about is places like the Atlantic, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Economist, the New Yorker. I mean, you could really count like high quality journalism organizations on two hands. And I worry, and this gets to your question about, poverty, that these places are becoming like trade publications for the elite. and it's sad to think about, but there's only a certain number of people, as I said, that pay for news. The New York Times has 13 million subscribers, but that's what, 4% of the country, 5% of the country, and everyone else is not getting the type of, fact-based, accurate information that they should be. So, like, this is one of the, big problems our country faces.
How do you address the question of sane-washing and liberal bias? Because voter fraud does not exist in this country. I mean, they've counted it as 0.000%. But articles come out that, in all the journals you just said, that talk about, the SAVE Act and how, voter fraud and that sort of thing, but they don't just come out with facts. Fox News is hookah. They say things that are just simply not true. They lost $800 million because of one of them, and that's only because that company, the Smartmatic, Dominion, sued them. Dominion quit. They wanted $1.5 billion, but they say their job isn't to reestablish honesty in the news, it's to run a business. How do you address sane washing and liberal bias?
Yeah, I don't really have a good answer for that. As it relates to voter fraud?
Voter fraud is one example of, there are, the guy who was just up for national security wouldn't say that the 2020 election wasn't stolen, right? So there's sane washing where both sides get equal merit in an article, and that's called liberal bias. Yeah. But in fact, it's fact, or alternative facts, as what's her name?
Yeah. Look, I think the media has come a long way over the past decade or so in the Trump era of calling it like it sees it when there's a lie that's said. There isn't both sidesism anymore, and I think the Atlantic is really the place I can speak to, has done a pretty good job of holding this administration to account when it's not telling the truth. And it's been hard because initially I think a lot of these news organizations came into this trying to be as balanced as possible, but we've entered this new era of some actual pretty leadership that I think has taken sort of truth to a level that is a challenge for everyone. So anyway, I don't want to get into it because it becomes a little too political. So I'm going to dodge your question.
You haven't mentioned Heather Cox Richardson yet. She is one of my great heroines, but how about that as a model? Because it's almost free and it's available and nonpartisan.
Yeah. So Heather Cox Richardson is fantastic. And obviously she publishes on Substack, if I have that right. She's one of the most popular Substacks out there. And look, Substack is a really compelling platform that has had a lot of business success and is actually, the Atlantic has lost writers to Substack because you could just hang up a shingle there, charge a subscription fee and, have your own business. I'm sure we all have our own, favorite Substack writers. Heather Cox Richardson is awesome. She came by the Atlantic once and talked to a bunch of us and was totally dynamic and fascinating. We had a great writer named Derek Thompson, who's, brilliant young writer. And he's very gifted, and he decided to leave the Atlantic because he wrote this book, Abundance, with Ezra Klein. It was a huge bestseller. He made a lot of money and felt like he could just go do this on his own. So he started his own Substack, and it's fabulous. But, he charges, I think, $80 a year for his Substack. So, it's really a value proposition. You could pay $80 for, one Derek Thompson, or you could pay $90 for, a few hundred staff at the Atlantic. I would argue for the latter. But but if you've got some extra money lying around, like Derek Thompson has a great Substack. So, the information landscape has become only more and more vast, and like Substack's a platform where a lot of people are doing great work, and Heather is one of them. So one and then the other. I'm sorry.
I was just wondering, you have a very upbeat kind of energy, and I wondered how, speaking of waking up and banging your head against the wall, how you personally keep such an upbeat kind of perspective, especially what you would say to young people to convince them to go into the field, given how grim the stories seem.
Isabel and I have a daughter who's 23 who, sadly has the disease. She wants to be a journalist. It's funny. On one, I wish, she wanted to be a vet or something like that sometimes. But no, look, I do think, and I really believe, and hopefully conveyed this, that, despite all the challenges, that journalism plays a very important role in our civic life and in society. And, so long as there's, a government, and so long as there's, law enforcement and, other public institutions, there needs to be journalists who are, holding power to account and reporting the news for people. So look, I don't think it's a growing business. And I think, if my daughter does pursue journalism, she's going to have a lot more challenges than, say, going into it, 40 or 50 years ago during the age of Watergate, when, golden age of newspapers and magazines. I mean, that's all in the rearview mirror. So it's just going to become harder and harder because the business model is strained. But if you're, I hate, it sounds a little cheesy, but like if it's your passion, I think there's always going to be, a place for journalism in the country. Behind you? Yeah. Okay, last question.
I was just going to ask you to talk a little bit more about local news, because it just seems like, I was a paper boy in the 1970s, and we used to have a lot of information that we were putting out there, and now the local news is so thin, and, there's always, city council and the school board, and there's all these things going on in wherever you live. I don't know how people keep track of it or participate in it at all, because the coverage has gotten so thin.
Yeah, look, I mean, that's why, like, one of the, main things that I focus on is supporting local newsrooms across the United States. And, it's hard because there's no for-profit business model for local news anymore. I think I've hopefully made the case that it truly is a dying business. But the nonprofit local news ecosystem is expanding, and there has been something of a revival in local news at the nonprofit level. So that's why I mentioned a couple of these organizations up in Maine. But all around the country, every day there's new ones. There's new ones being started. We recently gave a grant to a newsroom in Jacksonville, Florida, called The Tributary, and they initially started covering just Jacksonville. The Times Union there was the local paper, and it's like a shadow of its former self. And they've grown steadily, and now they're expanding into Florida. They just opened up, further into Florida. They opened up a Miami bureau, and they're opening up a bureau in Tampa on the West Coast. So that's like the good news, and it's why I think the nonprofit realm for local news is ultimately the way that we're all going to have to go here. So I've really enjoyed this. I really appreciate you all coming out. I brought some Atlantic swag. So there's tote bags, and here's the thing. I'm afraid that there's probably not enough for everyone. Here, just give me that tote bag. See the A? Do you get it? Right? It's very cool. It says the Atlantic. And the current newsstand issue. So please grab one on your way out, maybe like one per couple. And here's the thing. If you want one and there's none left, just email me No, really. At peterlattman@gmail.com, easy to remember, no dot, peterlattman@gmail.com with your address, and I'll make sure you get an Atlantic tote bag.
Thanks, Peter. We have a great subject next week. It's on affordable housing, which is a uniquely local problem. Peter Rothschild is the organizer, and I said to him, this better be the best one we've ever had. And he said, it may not be the best, but it's the most important. So we look forward to seeing you next week. Peter has the silver chalice for anyone who'd like to contribute. Thank you.